In the spring of 1221, a woman who had once been called the most powerful queen in Central Asia stood in chains before a victory feast in the ruins of her own palace. Her name was Turkin Katun, mother of the Khwarazm Shah, the ruler of an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India. 6 months earlier, she had lived in luxury beyond imagination, commanding armies, influencing her son's decisions, wearing robes woven with gold thread, eating from plates of solid silver. Now she stood barefoot on the marble floor of her own throne room, dressed in rags, her hands bound with rope, watching as Mongol generals sat in her husband's chairs and drank from her family's ceremonial cups. But what was about to happen to Turkin Katun was worse than chains or humiliation, or being forced to watch strangers celebrate in her palace. What was about to happen would reveal the true genius of Genghis Khan's method of conquest, a method that understood something profound about power and revenge that most conquerors throughout history never grasped. Genghis Khan knew that killing your enemies was easy. Any soldier could do that. Any army could burn a city and slaughter its inhabitants. But that was not true conquest. True conquest meant making your enemies wish they had died. True conquest meant taking everything they valued and turning it into an instrument of their humiliation. True conquest meant ensuring that even in death, they would know that everything they had built, everyone they had loved, every legacy they had hoped to leave, had been erased and repurposed to serve the very people who had destroyed them. What Genghis Khan did to the wives of his enemies was not about desire or lust or even violence in the conventional sense. It was about something far more calculated, far more psychologically devastating. It was about erasing entire bloodlines, about turning royal women into living monuments to their husbands' failures, about creating a system of humiliation so complete that the mere threat of it would make kings surrender their cities without a fight. And what happened to Turkin Katun in that throne room? What she was forced to do in front of the assembled Mongol army? What became of her in the months and years that followed? That story will reveal everything you need to understand about how the Mongols built the largest contiguous land empire in human history, not just through military might, but through psychological warfare. So sophisticated that it still seems almost incomprehensible today. This is the story of what Genghis Khan did to the wives of his enemies. And I need you to understand from the beginning that everything I am about to tell you is documented in historical chronicles written by Persian, Chinese, and Mongol historians who witnessed or recorded these events. These are not legends or exaggerations. These are practices that were deliberately designed, systematically implemented, and carefully recorded, because the Mongols understood that the story of what happened to defeated enemies' wives was as important as the military victories themselves. If you want to understand how empires are built not just with swords, but with terror, how women's bodies become battlefields for male honor and dynastic power, how systematic humiliation can be weaponized as effectively as any army, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what you're about to learn will change how you understand conquest, power, and the real costs of empire building. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let me tell you about how Genghis Khan developed this system, because to understand what happened to Turkin Katun, you need to understand the Mongol philosophy of conquest. Genghis Khan was born as Temujin around 1162 in the harsh steppes of Mongolia, into a world where survival itself was a daily struggle. His father was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was 9 years old. His family was abandoned by their clan and left to starve on the steppes. Temujin spent his childhood and adolescence in grinding poverty, always on the edge of starvation, watching his mother dig for roots to feed her children, learning that the world was divided into those who had power and those who suffered at the hands of the powerful. But Temujin did not just survive. He studied, he observed, he learned lessons that would shape his approach to conquest for the rest of his life. He learned that when his father had been alive, people had feared and respected their family. When his father died, that fear and respect vanished instantly. People who had once bowed to his father now stole from his mother and mocked his family. This taught Temujin a crucial lesson. Power was not inherent. It was not about bloodlines or noble birth or divine right. Power was about fear and respect, and those things had to be actively maintained through demonstration and through making examples that people would remember. He learned another lesson when he was captured by a rival clan as a young man and held as a slave in a wooden collar that prevented him from lying down or sleeping comfortably. During his captivity, Temujin observed how the clan celebrated their victory over his small family group. They did not just capture him. They paraded him before the assembled clan, forcing him to serve at their feasts, making him watch as they discussed dividing up the horses and livestock that had belonged to his family. The physical captivity was painful, but the psychological humiliation of being displayed as a trophy, of being forced to participate in the celebration of his own family's defeat, burned into Temujin's memory. He escaped eventually, but he never forgot that humiliation felt worse than physical pain, that being forced to witness and participate in your own defeat was more devastating than simply being killed. When Temujin began his rise to power, uniting the fractious Mongol tribes through a combination of military genius and diplomatic skill, he remembered these lessons. He understood that conquest was not just about defeating enemies militarily, but about breaking them psychologically, about creating such complete humiliation that resistance would seem not just futile but unthinkable. By 1206, Temujin had united the Mongol tribes and taken the title Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. He had created a military machine, unlike anything the world had seen, with cavalry that could cover vast distances at incredible speed, with intelligence networks that gathered information from across Asia, with siege weapons and tactics that could reduce any city to rubble. But his genius was not just military, it was psychological. Genghis Khan understood something that most conquerors did not. The purpose of war was not the fighting itself, but what came after. Wars were won not when the enemy army was destroyed, but when the enemy population was so terrified, so broken, so convinced of the futility of resistance that they would surrender without fighting. And the most effective way to create that level of terror was not through indiscriminate violence any barbarian could burn and kill, but through targeted, systematic, memorable acts of humiliation that would be talked about for generations. This is where the treatment of enemy wives became central to Mongol conquest strategy. Genghis Khan recognized that in the patriarchal societies he was conquering, from China to Persia to Central Asia to Eastern Europe, a man's honor was tied completely to his ability to protect his family, particularly his wives and daughters. A man who could not protect his women was not a man at all. He was a failure, an object of contempt, someone whose name would be spoken with mockery rather than respect. So Genghis Khan created a system where defeating an enemy meant not just killing him or taking his lands, but specifically, deliberately, systematically targeting his wives and daughters in ways designed to maximize humiliation. The goal was to make every man who heard the story understand that resisting the Mongols meant not just his own death, but something far worse, the complete destruction of his honor, the enslavement and humiliation of his women, the erasure of his bloodline, the guarantee that his name would be remembered only as a cautionary tale of failure. This was not about Mongol soldiers being unable to control their desires or about random violence happening in the chaos of war. This was policy. This was strategy. This was systematically implemented across every campaign the Mongols conducted. The treatment of enemy wives was as carefully planned as the military campaigns themselves, designed to serve specific, strategic purposes. Let me tell you about the first principle of this system, the understanding that a dead enemy was a defeated enemy, but a humiliated enemy whose wife had been taken, whose daughters had been distributed as gifts to Mongol officers, whose bloodline had been absorbed into Mongol lineages. That enemy was erased. His legacy was destroyed. His name would be forgotten or remembered only with contempt. And that was true conquest. The Mongol chronicles, particularly the secret history of the Mongols, written in the decades after Genghis Khan's death, make this philosophy explicit. The greatest revenge against an enemy was not to kill him, but to make him watch as his wife serves your table and his children call you father. This was stated openly, celebrated as the highest form of victory. Persian historians who witnessed and recorded the Mongol conquests, chroniclers like Atamalik Juvayni and Rashid al-Din, who served in Mongol courts and had access to official records, documented this practice repeatedly. They described how the wives of defeated rulers were specifically targeted not for random violence, but for systematic humiliation designed to erase their husbands' legacies. Now let me tell you how this system worked in practice, starting with what the Mongols did immediately after capturing a city whose ruler had resisted them. And I promise you, understanding this process will help you understand what happened to Turkin Katun and why her fate was considered the perfect example of Mongol psychological warfare. When a Mongol army approached a city, they would typically send envoys first with a simple message: surrender now, pay tribute, acknowledge Genghis Khan as your overlord, and you will be spared. Your ruler can remain in power as a vassal. Your people can continue their lives. Your property will not be touched. But if you resist, if you force us to besiege your city, if you make us fight for what we are offering to take peacefully, then what follows will be total. We will destroy everything. We will kill the men. We will enslave the women and children. And we will specifically ensure that your ruler's family suffers humiliation so complete that the story will be told for 1,000 years as a warning to others who might think of resistance. This was not an empty threat. The Mongols followed through every single time. They had to, because their entire strategy depended on cities hearing about what happened to those who resisted and choosing to surrender rather than fight. The Mongol army was relatively small, never more than a few 100,000 men spread across a continent. They could not afford to fight for every city. They needed cities to surrender out of fear. So they created that fear deliberately and maintained it through spectacular demonstrations of what happened to those who resisted. When a city that had refused to surrender was finally taken, the Mongol forces would systematically round up the population. The men would typically be separated and executed, though skilled craftsmen might be spared and sent to Mongolia to serve the empire. The women and children would be gathered in groups to be distributed as spoils. But before any of that happened, the Mongols would specifically search for the ruler's family, his wives, his daughters, his mother if she was still alive, his sisters. These women would be brought before the Mongol commanders while the city was still burning, while the streets were still filled with the dead, while the smoke of destroyed buildings filled the air. They would be stripped of their royal clothing, of their jewelry, of every marker of their status. They would be dressed in simple clothes or sometimes in rags. Their elaborate hairstyles would be cut off. Everything that marked them as royalty would be removed, a deliberate reversal of their former status. Then came the first public humiliation. These women would be displayed before the assembled Mongol army. They would be paraded through the army camp, sometimes in chains, sometimes simply under guard, while Mongol soldiers looked at them and understood that these were the wives and daughters of the man who had dared to resist. The parade served multiple purposes. It rewarded the soldiers with the spectacle of total victory. It demonstrated to any surviving citizens of the captured city that their rulers could not protect even their own families. And it created stories that would spread, ensuring that the next city the Mongols approached would have heard what happened to the families of those who resisted. But the display was just the beginning. What happened next depended on the woman's rank and on decisions made by Genghis Khan or his senior commanders about how to maximize the strategic value of her humiliation. If the captured woman was the wife or daughter of a particularly important ruler, someone whose name was known across the region, she might be taken as a wife by Genghis Khan himself or by one of his sons or senior generals. This was not marriage in any conventional sense. It was forced, obviously. But more than that, it was symbolic. These marriages served to legitimize Mongol rule by absorbing the bloodlines of defeated dynasties. When a Mongol Khan married a captured queen, he was making a statement. Your royal family is now Mongol property. Your bloodline now serves us. Any children born from this union will be Mongols, not members of your nation. These forced marriages were particularly devastating because they often produced children, and those children were raised as Mongols, given Mongol names, taught to honor Genghis Khan and the Mongol ancestors, completely severed from their maternal heritage. A captured queen who bore a son to a Mongol Khan would have to watch that son grow up speaking Mongolian, wearing Mongol clothes, worshipping Mongol spirits, perhaps eventually leading Mongol armies against the remnants of her own people. The child was a living symbol of her husband's defeat and her own subjugation. Some of these captured wives became historically important figures in the Mongol Empire, not because they were honored or respected, but because they survived and adapted to their captivity. Tarajin Katun, for example, was the widow of a Merkit Khan who was defeated by Genghis Khan in the early 1200s. She was captured and forcibly married to Ogadai, Genghis Khan's third son, who eventually became the second great Khan. Turkin had no choice in this arrangement. She was a spoil of war, taken by the man whose father had killed her first husband. But she was intelligent and adaptable, and she eventually gained significant influence in Ogadai's court. After Ogadai's death, she served as regent of the entire Mongol Empire for 5 years, making her one of the most powerful women in the world. But her power came only after years of captivity and subjugation. Only after bearing children to her captor. Only after completely abandoning any loyalty to her birth family and her first husband's memory. Her story was held up by the Mongols as an example of how the empire absorbed defeated peoples, how even enemy wives could be transformed into Mongol assets if they submitted completely. But from another perspective, her story is about how a woman had to utterly erase her own past and collaborate completely with the people who destroyed her first family in order to survive and eventually gain any power at all. If a captured noblewoman was not taken as a wife by a senior Mongol leader, her fate would typically be distribution as a gift to a loyal general or subordinate Khan. The Mongols had a sophisticated system of rewarding military service and loyalty, and captured noblewomen were considered valuable gifts. A general who had distinguished himself in battle might be rewarded with one or several captured women from the enemy's noble families. This served multiple purposes. It rewarded loyalty. It humiliated the defeated enemy by showing that his women were considered mere property to be given away. And it spread the story of what happened to enemy wives throughout the Mongol officer corps and beyond. The women, distributed this way, became concubines, or servants, in Mongol households. They might bear children who would be raised as Mongols. They might spend their lives doing domestic work for the families of men who had killed their husbands. They typically lost all connection to their former lives, forbidden from speaking their native languages, forbidden from practicing their religions, forbidden from maintaining any aspect of their former identities. Lower-ranking women from captured cities, the wives of nobles or merchants rather than royalty, might be sold into slavery or sent back to Mongolia to work in Mongol households there. The Mongol Empire developed a massive slave trade, with captured women being transported across thousands of miles to serve in distant regions where they would never encounter anyone who spoke their language or knew their homeland. But for the highest-ranking women, particularly the wives and mothers of rulers who had most actively resisted the Mongols, there was often a specific, additional layer of humiliation designed to create the most memorable and devastating stories. These women might be forced to serve at Mongol victory celebrations, to pour wine for the men who had killed their husbands, to stand and wait on tables while Mongol officers sat in their husbands' chairs and ate off their families' ceremonial plates. Persian chroniclers describe scenes of captured queens being made to stand for hours at banquets, holding wine jugs, required to refill the cups of Mongol generals whenever they were empty. The queens were not allowed to sit, not allowed to eat, not allowed to speak unless spoken to. They stood there in simple dress, all their royal finery stripped away, serving the men who had destroyed their kingdoms, while those men joked and celebrated and discussed how to divide up the conquered territories. This ritualized humiliation served crucial purposes in Mongol conquest strategy. It demonstrated total victory in a way that was visceral and memorable. It created stories that would spread rapidly. Survivors would tell others what they had seen, and the stories would be embellished and passed on until everyone in the region knew exactly what the Mongols did to the families of rulers who resisted. And it broke the spirit of any remaining resistance in the captured city by showing that even the highest-ranking, most protected women could be reduced to servants in a matter of days. Now, let me tell you about the conquest that best exemplifies all of these practices. The campaign where Genghis Khan's system of humiliating enemy wives reached its most sophisticated and most devastating implementation. This is the story of what happened to the Khwarazmian Empire, and particularly to the family of Shah Ala ad-Din, Muhammad II, and his mother, Turkin Katun. And I promise you, what happened to them was so calculated, so complete, so psychologically devastating that even the Persian chroniclers who recorded it struggled to find words for the level of humiliation involved. The Khwarazmian Empire in 1219 was one of the most powerful states in Central Asia. It controlled a vast territory that included most of modern Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and parts of Pakistan and western China. Its capital at Samarkand was one of the richest cities in the world, a center of trade on the Silk Road where merchants from China, India, the Middle East, and Europe met to exchange goods. The empire was wealthy, cultured, militarily powerful, and ruled by Shah Muhammad II, who commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Shah Muhammad was nominally a vassal of the Karakitai, but he had grown powerful enough to consider himself independent, and he dreamed of expanding his empire even further. His mother, Turkin Katun, was one of the most powerful women in the Islamic world. She was not just the Shah's mother, but his most trusted advisor, the person who controlled access to him, who influenced major decisions, who commanded respect throughout the empire. She lived in incredible luxury, with palaces across the empire, with servants numbering in the thousands, with wealth that seemed limitless. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan to the Khwarazmian Empire, accompanied by ambassadors, carrying a message proposing peaceful trade relations between the Mongol Empire and Khwarazm. The caravan arrived at the border city of Otrar, where the governor, a man named Inalchuk, who was related to Turkin Katun, made a catastrophic decision. Suspecting that some of the merchants were Mongol spies, which may have been true, he arrested the entire caravan and executed all the merchants, several dozen men, and confiscated their valuable goods. When news reached Genghis Khan, he sent ambassadors to Shah Muhammad demanding that the governor be punished and that compensation be paid for the murdered merchants. Shah Muhammad, perhaps under pressure from his mother and other advisors who saw the Mongols as barbaric nomads who could be insulted with impunity, not only refused but had the ambassadors killed, one beheaded, the others sent back to Genghis with their beards burned off, an intentional insult in both Mongol and Persian culture. This was exactly the kind of insult that Genghis Khan's system was designed to respond to. The Shah had not just refused a reasonable demand, he had shown contempt for the Mongols, had treated Genghis Khan's ambassadors with deliberate disrespect, had essentially stated that he did not fear the Mongol Empire and did not believe it could threaten his powerful kingdom. Genghis Khan's response would be to prove exactly how wrong that calculation was, and to create such a complete example of what happened to rulers who insulted the Mongols that no one would ever make the same mistake again. In 1219, Genghis Khan personally led an army of perhaps 150,000 men westward toward the Khwarazmian Empire. The Shah commanded armies that were significantly larger on paper, perhaps 400,000 men, but they were scattered across the vast empire, defending different cities. The Mongol forces split into several columns that moved with incredible speed, besieging multiple cities simultaneously, preventing the Khwarazmian forces from concentrating their strength. The details of the military campaign are fascinating. The Mongols' brilliant tactics, their use of captured engineers to build siege weapons, their psychological warfare that caused entire cities to surrender without fighting. But what matters for our story is what happened when the Mongol forces began capturing Khwarazmian cities, and particularly what Genghis Khan ordered done with captured noblewomen as his armies swept across the empire. The Mongol forces took city after city with shocking speed. Bukhara fell in 1220. Samarkand, the great capital, surrendered after only 5 days of siege in 1220. The Shah fled before the advancing Mongols, leaving his empire to collapse behind him. He died on an island in the Caspian Sea, broken and humiliated, having lost everything in less than 2 years. But before the Shah fled, before he abandoned his capital and his empire, he left behind his family, including his mother, Turkin Katun. Whether he thought they would be safe, whether he simply panicked and forgot about them in his flight, or whether he calculated that the Mongols might spare them, we don't know. What we do know is what happened to them after the Mongols captured Samarkand. Turkin Katun was found in one of the royal palaces in Samarkand. She was approximately 60 years old, an age of great respect in medieval society. She had been one of the most powerful women in the Islamic world, a woman who had commanded armies, who had made and unmade governors, who had influenced decisions of war and peace. She had lived her entire adult life in luxury and power, surrounded by servants and sycophants, treated with the utmost deference by everyone she encountered. The Mongol soldiers who captured her showed no deference at all. She was immediately stripped of her royal clothing and her jewelry. The elaborate robes woven with gold thread, the jewels that marked her status, the veils and decorations that signified her rank, all were removed and added to the pile of loot being collected from the palace. She was dressed in simple, coarse clothing. Her elaborate hairstyle was cut off. She was bound and brought before the Mongol commanders like any other prisoner. Then she was held in captivity for several days while the Mongols organized their victory celebration. She could hear the sounds of the city being systematically looted, of buildings being destroyed, of people being rounded up to be distributed as slaves. She could hear Mongol soldiers celebrating in the palace above her cell, drinking the Shah's wine, eating the palace's food stores, lounging in the halls where she had once walked as one of the most powerful people in the empire. When the victory feast was organized, Turkin Katun was brought up from her cell. The feast was held in the main throne room of the palace, the very room where she had stood beside her son as ambassadors from across the Islamic world had paid tribute, where she had influenced decisions that affected millions of people, where she had been treated like royalty because she was royalty. Now she stood in that same room in chains, wearing rags, while Mongol generals sat on the throne and on the cushions where her family had Saturday, and she was told what her role would be in this feast. She would serve wine to the Mongol officers. She would stand and wait, holding a wine jug, and whenever a Mongol general's cup was empty, she would refill it. She would do this for the entire feast, which would last for hours. She would not be allowed to sit. She would not be given food or drink. She would simply stand and serve, a living symbol of how completely the Khwarazmian Empire had been defeated and humiliated. The Persian chronicler Juvayni, who recorded this event and who had access to both Mongol and Persian sources, describes the scene with barely concealed horror. He writes that Turkin Katun stood in her own throne room, serving wine to the men who had killed her guards and her servants and thousands of her people, forced to watch as these men celebrated in the ruins of her family's power, forced to participate in the celebration of her own family's destruction. The feast lasted for hours. Turkin Katun stood the entire time, her feet swelling, her back aching, holding the wine jug and refilling cups. The Mongol officers joked and laughed and discussed how they would divide up the territories of the Khwarazmian Empire. They ate the food from the palace kitchens, and drank the wine from the palace cellars, and lounged on cushions in the throne room, treating it like any other victory celebration, while the former Queen Mother stood before them like a servant. But the humiliation did not end when the feast ended. After the celebration, Turkin Katun was taken into the household of one of Genghis Khan's sons. Sources differ on whether it was Jochi or Chagatai as a servant. She was not taken as a wife because she was considered too old for that purpose. Instead, she became a slave in a Mongol household, doing domestic work, serving at meals, living in conditions of poverty that were unimaginable compared to her former life. She lived in this captivity for several years before dying, the exact date and circumstances unknown. She was buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave somewhere in Mongolia, thousands of miles from her homeland, her life ending in slavery and humiliation after decades of power and luxury. Her son, the Shah, had died in exile, knowing that his mother had been captured and enslaved. Her entire family's power and legacy had been erased in less than 2 years. But Turkin Katun's story was not just a tragedy, it was a weapon. The story of what happened to her spread rapidly throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Within months, everyone from China to the Middle East to Eastern Europe had heard the story of how the most powerful queen in Central Asia had been reduced to serving wine to Mongol generals in her own throne room, how she had ended her life as a slave doing domestic work in Mongolia. The story was told and retold, embellished, used as an example of what happened to rulers who resisted the Mongols. And the story had exactly the effect Genghis Khan intended. When Mongol armies approached other cities and kingdoms in the years that followed, rulers remembered what had happened to the Khwarazmian Empire. They remembered that Shah Muhammad had commanded huge armies but had died in exile. They remembered that Turkin Katun had been one of the most powerful women in the world but had ended her life as a slave. And many of them chose to surrender rather than risk the same fate. This was the genius of Genghis Khan's system. He did not need to capture and humiliate every ruler's family. He just needed to do it spectacularly and memorably enough that the stories would spread and make future conquests easier. The humiliation of Turkin Katun paid strategic dividends for decades, making the Mongol conquest of much of Asia and Eastern Europe possible with relatively small armies because cities would surrender rather than fight once they heard what resistance would cost them. But Turkin Katun's story, as complete as it was, represents only one example of a system that was implemented across dozens of campaigns over decades. Let me tell you about other women whose fates illustrate different aspects of how the Mongols used the humiliation of enemy wives as a weapon of conquest. The Tangut state, also called the Western Xia, occupied territory in what is now northwestern China. They had been vassals of the Mongols, but rebelled in 1225, refusing to provide troops for a Mongol campaign. Genghis Khan, now in his 60s and nearing the end of his life, personally led a campaign against the Tanguts. He was furious at what he saw as betrayal by people who had sworn loyalty to him, and he ordered that the Tangut royal family be completely destroyed. The Tangut emperor died or was killed during the campaign. His wives and daughters were captured when the Mongol forces took the Tangut capital. What happened to them was recorded in multiple sources. The women of the imperial family were divided among Mongol officers as slaves and concubines. Some were sent to Mongolia. Others were distributed to various Mongol commanders as rewards. All of them were deliberately separated from each other to prevent them from maintaining family connections or preserving Tangut identity. But before they were distributed, they were displayed publicly in a ceremony designed to demonstrate the complete subjugation of the Tangut state. The women were paraded through the army camp, stripped of their royal regalia, their hair cut off, dressed as slaves. Mongol soldiers lined up to watch as the Tangut royal family was marched past them in chains, a visceral demonstration that the Tanguts had been defeated so completely that even their highest-ranking women were now Mongol property. The deliberate humiliation was designed to break any remaining Tangut resistance and to send a message to other vassal states that betrayal would result not just in military defeat, but in the complete erasure of the ruling family's honor and identity. The message was received. Other Mongol vassals remained loyal after the Tangut example, not out of affection for the Mongols, but out of fear of what would happen to their families if they rebelled. The Jin dynasty in northern China resisted the Mongols for decades, from 1211 to 1234. The Jin were ethnically Jurchen, a semi-nomadic people who had conquered northern China and established a dynasty there. They had sophisticated armies, fortified cities, and initially believed they could resist the Mongol invasions. As the Mongols captured Jin cities one by one over the course of this long war, they systematically targeted the families of Jin nobles and officials. Women from aristocratic Jin families were captured by the thousands. Some were sold into slavery and sent across the Mongol Empire. Others were distributed to Mongol households as concubines and servants. The most high-ranking were sometimes taken as wives by Mongol nobles in forced marriages designed to legitimize Mongol rule over former Jin territories. Chinese chronicles from this period describe processions of captured Jin noblewomen being marched through Mongol army camps, displayed as trophies before being distributed. The chronicles describe how some of these women committed suicide rather than submit to captivity, throwing themselves from city walls or drowning themselves in rivers as Mongol forces approached, but most had no choice. They were captured, distributed, and absorbed into Mongol households where they disappeared from historical record, their fates unknown except that they lived out their lives in captivity far from their homes. The psychological impact of these practices extended far beyond the women who were directly affected. Every noble family in the Jin dynasty lived with the knowledge that if their city was captured, if their forces were defeated, the women of their family would face this fate. This knowledge affected military decisions, political calculations, and eventually contributed to the Jin dynasty's surrender after decades of resistance. The Jin court finally agreed to a humiliating peace, partly because the alternative, continued resistance leading to the capture and enslavement of thousands more noble families, seemed worse than submission. When the Mongols invaded Eastern Europe in the 1230s and 1240s, they brought these same practices with them. The Rus principalities, the various kingdoms and principalities in what is now Russia and Ukraine, were defeated one by one. Mongol forces captured cities like Vladimir, Suzdal, Kiev, and others, and in each case they specifically targeted the families of local rulers. Russian chronicles from this period, written by Orthodox monks who witnessed or heard about these events, describe Mongol forces searching for the wives and daughters of princes and nobles after capturing cities. The chronicles describe women being taken as slaves, being distributed among Mongol warriors, being sent eastward to Mongolia, never to return. The chronicles describe the horror and shame felt by surviving populations at being unable to protect their women, at having to watch as noble women were marched away in chains. One particularly detailed account describes what happened after the Mongols captured the city of Ryazan in 1237. The Mongol forces specifically sought out the family of Prince Yuri of Ryazan. His wife, Princess Euphraxia, was captured along with other women of the princely family. According to the chronicle, when she learned that she was to be distributed as a concubine to Mongol officers, Princess Euphraxia threw herself from the city walls with her infant son rather than submit to that fate. The chronicle treats her death as martyrdom, a final assertion of honor in the face of unavoidable humiliation. But most women captured during the Mongol invasion of the Rus principalities did not have the option of suicide, or chose not to take it. They were marched eastward to uncertain fates in Mongol captivity. Some ended up in Mongol households in Mongolia. Others were distributed to the various khanates that formed from Genghis Khan's empire after his death. A few eventually returned to Rus territories, sometimes decades after their capture, so changed by their experiences that they barely recognized their former homes. The Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that ruled over the Rus principalities for centuries, was built partly on this foundation of terror. The Rus princes paid tribute not just to avoid military attacks, but to avoid having their families targeted the way families had been targeted during the initial conquest. The memory of what had happened in the 1230s and 40s remained vivid for generations, keeping the Rus principalities submissive to Mongol rule. Now, let me tell you about an aspect of this system that goes beyond even the immediate humiliation and captivity, the deliberate erasure of bloodlines through forced reproduction. This was perhaps the most sophisticated and most devastating element of Genghis Khan's approach to treating enemy wives. When a high-ranking woman was taken as a wife or concubine by a Mongol Khan or noble, she would typically bear children. These children were considered Mongol, not members of the mother's original nationality or dynasty. They were given Mongol names, raised speaking Mongolian, taught to worship the Mongol spirits and ancestors, and completely integrated into Mongol society. This meant that a captured queen who bore a son to her Mongol captor would have to watch that son grow up as a Mongol, with no connection to his maternal grandfather's dynasty or culture. If she tried to teach him about his mother's heritage, she would be punished or prevented from seeing him. The child represented the ultimate erasure of her husband's legacy, his own grandson carrying his blood, but raised as a member of the people who had destroyed him. Some of these children of captured women rose to significant positions in the Mongol Empire. The Mongol nobility was pragmatic about bloodlines. They cared about loyalty and capability more than pure Mongol ancestry. So a son born to a captured Chinese princess and a Mongol general might grow up to become a general himself or a governor of Mongol territories in China. He would be Mongol in every way that mattered, in language, culture, loyalty, even though half his heritage was Chinese. From the Mongol perspective, this was perfect conquest. They were not just defeating enemy dynasties, they were absorbing them, transforming enemy bloodlines into Mongol assets. The children born from these forced unions were living proof that resistance was futile because even if you died fighting the Mongols, your own grandchildren might grow up serving the Mongol Empire. From the perspective of the captured women, this was perhaps the deepest level of humiliation. They were forced not just to submit to their captors, but to bear children who would grow up loyal to the people who had destroyed their fathers. They had to watch their own sons learn to speak Mongolian, to honor Mongol ancestors, perhaps even to lead Mongol armies against the remnants of their maternal peoples. The biological imperative to love and care for their children was twisted into a form of torture, because every moment spent with those children was a reminder of how completely their former lives had been erased. The scale of this practice was enormous. Genghis Khan himself probably fathered hundreds of children with dozens of women, most of whom were captured from conquered peoples. His sons and grandsons did the same. Modern genetic studies have shown that a significant percentage of people in the territories, once controlled by the Mongol Empire, carry genetic markers associated with the Mongol royal family, suggesting that millions of people today are descended from Genghis Khan and his immediate family. Many of those descendants come from lineages that began with captured women from conquered peoples, women whose names we will never know, but whose genetic legacy continues. This genetic legacy is presented in modern popular culture as evidence of Genghis Khan's virility or success, but it's important to understand what it actually represents. Systematic forced reproduction on a massive scale, the biological absorption of defeated peoples into the Mongol bloodline, the transformation of conquered women into instruments for producing the next generation of Mongol warriors and administrators. Now let me tell you about what happened to these women in the long term, after the initial capture and humiliation, because the story does not end with their enslavement or forced marriage. Many of these women lived for decades in Mongol captivity, and their experiences reveal the full scope of what Genghis Khan's system meant for individual lives. Women who were taken into Mongol households as concubines or servants typically lost all connection to their former identities. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages to each other or to their children. They were forbidden from practicing their religions openly. They were required to learn Mongolian, to adopt Mongol dress and customs, to participate in Mongol religious ceremonies honoring spirits and ancestors that were not theirs. This forced assimilation was not incidental. It was deliberate policy designed to prevent captured women from maintaining cultural connections that might foster resistance or preserve alternative identities. The Mongols understood that culture and identity were carried through language, religion, and custom, so they systematically suppressed these things among captured populations. Women who tried to maintain their former identities, or who tried to teach their children about their maternal heritage, were punished. Punishments might include beatings, separation from their children, being sold or given away to a different household, or in extreme cases, execution. The message was clear: your old identity is dead. You are Mongol now, or you are nothing. For women who had been queens or princesses, this erasure of identity was particularly devastating. They had gone from being among the most important people in their societies, with status and power and public recognition, to being completely nameless and powerless. They lived in Mongol households where no one knew or cared that they had once been royalty. Their status meant nothing. Their former lives were erased as thoroughly as if they had never happened. Many of these women never saw their homelands again. They lived out their lives in Mongolia, or in the various Mongol territories scattered across Asia, thousands of miles from where they were born. They died and were buried in unmarked graves or in Mongol cemeteries, with no connection to their birth families or their former nations. Their deaths were not recorded, except perhaps in household records that noted the loss of a servant or concubine. Their names disappeared from history. This erasure extended even to their deaths. In their birth cultures, royal women would have expected elaborate funerals, burial in dynastic tombs, prayers, and ceremonies to honor their memory. In Mongol captivity, they received none of this. They were buried like any other slave or servant, without ceremony, without markers, without anything to indicate that they had once been important. Their families back home often never learned what happened to them, never knew where they died or where they were buried. The psychological toll of this existence is difficult to imagine. These women had to live knowing that everything they had once been was gone forever, that they would die in captivity, that they would never return home, that their children, if they had any, would grow up as Mongols with no connection to their maternal heritage. They had to live with the knowledge that their husbands and fathers had failed to protect them, that their former subjects had been unable or unwilling to rescue them, that they had been abandoned to their fates. Some women in these circumstances managed to find ways to survive psychologically. They might form bonds with other captured women, creating informal support networks within Mongol households. They might find meaning in their children, even if those children were being raised as Mongols. They might convert genuinely to Mongol beliefs and customs, finding it easier to embrace their new identity than to maintain the painful gap between who they had been and who they had become. Other women never adapted. They spent decades in depression and despair, going through the motions of their daily work but never accepting their fates, always longing for homes they would never see again. Some eventually died by suicide, unable to continue living in circumstances that felt unbearable. Others simply wasted away, losing the will to live, dying prematurely from illnesses that might have been survivable if they had had any reason to fight to stay alive. The Mongol system did not care which path these women took, whether they adapted or despaired, whether they found ways to survive psychologically or were broken by their circumstances. The strategic purpose had been achieved. They had been taken from their families, used to humiliate their husbands and fathers, prevented from maintaining their former identities, and absorbed into the Mongol system as completely as if they had been born Mongol. They were living proof of what happened to families that resisted the Mongol Empire. Now, let me tell you about how this system was refined and systematized under Genghis Khan's successors, because the practices I've described did not end with Genghis Khan's death in 1227. His sons and grandsons continued and expanded these practices as the Mongol Empire reached its greatest extent in the decades after his death. Ogedei Khan, Genghis's third son, who became the second great Khan, continued his father's practices of taking captured noble women as wives and concubines. Guyuk Khan and Möngke Khan did the same. When Kublai Khan conquered the southern Song dynasty and completed the Mongol conquest of China in 1279, the Song imperial family was captured, and the women of the imperial family were distributed according to the same patterns established by Genghis Khan decades earlier. The Song emperor's concubines and the wives of Song nobles were divided among Mongol officers. Some were taken into the household of Kublai Khan himself. Others were given as rewards to generals who had distinguished themselves in the campaign. The former Song Empress Dowager was forced into a Buddhist convent, a form of captivity that allowed Kublai to claim he was being merciful while ensuring she could never return to political life or remarry. In the Middle East, Hulagu Khan, another of Genghis's grandsons, led the Mongol conquest of Persia and the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate in 1258. When Baghdad fell, the caliph's household was captured. The women of the caliph's family, his wives, his daughters, his female relatives, were taken by Mongol forces. Some were kept by Hulagu himself, others were distributed to his officers. The former household of the caliph, which had numbered in the hundreds, was scattered across the Mongol Empire, the women sent to various destinations to serve in Mongol households. These practices continued for as long as the Mongol Empire remained unified, and even after it fragmented into separate khanates. The Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Yuan dynasty in China, all of these successor states continued to treat captured enemy wives according to the patterns established by Genghis Khan. The system worked. It spread terror effectively. It made conquest easier, so it was maintained across 3 generations and more than a century of Mongol expansion. The systematic nature of these practices is important to understand. This was not random violence or individual soldiers acting on their own impulses. This was policy, implemented consistently across different campaigns, different regions, different decades. The treatment of enemy wives was as much a part of Mongol military strategy as their cavalry tactics or their use of siege weapons. It was taught, practiced, and refined over time. Now let me tell you about the long-term effects of this system, about how it shaped the entire Mongol Empire and the territories it conquered, because the impact extended far beyond the individual women who were captured and their families who were destroyed. The terror generated by the systematic humiliation of enemy wives made it possible for relatively small Mongol armies to control vast territories. The Mongol Empire at its height controlled perhaps 24 million square kilometers, about a quarter of the habitable Earth. This was accomplished with armies that never numbered more than a few 100,000 soldiers. How was such control possible with such small forces? The answer is terror. The Mongols created such intense fear of what would happen if you resisted. Fear not just of military defeat, but of complete personal humiliation, enslavement of your family, erasure of your bloodline, guarantee that your name would be remembered only as a cautionary tale, that most people chose submission over resistance. Cities would surrender after minimal fighting. Nobles would swear loyalty without having to be defeated militarily. Entire regions would accept Mongol rule without serious resistance because the alternative seemed so much worse. This terror was maintained through stories. The stories of what happened to Turkin Katun, to the Tangut royal family, to countless other enemy wives spread throughout Asia and Europe. These stories were told and retold, embellished, used as warnings and threats. The stories probably grew more horrifying in the retelling, but they didn't need to be exaggerated much because the reality was horrifying enough. The Mongols did not discourage these stories. They encouraged them. They understood that the more people feared Mongol conquest, the less actual fighting the Mongols would have to do. The story of a captured queen forced to serve wine to her captors was worth thousands of soldiers because it made other queens and kings more willing to surrender without fighting. This system of terror-based conquest allowed the Mongols to build the largest contiguous land empire in human history with relatively minimal loss of Mongol life. Most of the fighting was done by auxiliary forces, soldiers from conquered peoples pressed into Mongol service. Most cities surrendered without major battles. Most rulers submitted when Mongol armies approached because they had heard the stories and understood what resistance would cost them. But the system had costs beyond the obvious tragedy of the women who were directly victimized. It created a culture of fear and submission throughout the territories the Mongols controlled. It established patterns of absolute authority and systematic humiliation that persisted long after the Mongol Empire fragmented and eventually fell. The successor states to the Mongol Empire, the various khanates and the kingdoms that eventually broke free from Mongol control, inherited and sometimes continued these practices. Rulers throughout Asia and Eastern Europe learned from the Mongol example that systematic humiliation of enemies' families was an effective tool of control. Some adopted similar practices in their own conquests and in maintaining their own authority. The psychological legacy lasted even longer. Throughout the regions the Mongols conquered, the memory of what happened during the initial conquests persisted for generations. People remembered what had happened to the families of those who resisted. They remembered the stories of captured queens and enslaved noblewomen. These memories shaped how people thought about power, resistance, and the costs of defying authority. In China, the memory of the Mongol conquest, and particularly of what happened to the Song dynasty's royal family, influenced how later dynasties thought about defending their territories and protecting their families. Elaborate plans were made for evacuating royal families if invasion threatened. Protocols were established for ensuring that royal women would never face the fate that Song royal women had faced. In Russia and Eastern Europe, the memory of the Mongol invasion and the Golden Horde's subsequent rule shaped political culture for centuries. The phrase Mongol yoke entered the Russian language to describe the period of Mongol domination, and the memory of that period influenced how Russians thought about power, authority, and the importance of strong, centralized control to prevent foreign domination. In the Middle East and Central Asia, the memory of the Mongol destruction of the Khwarazmian Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate became part of Islamic historical consciousness. The stories of what happened to Muslim queens and noblewomen during these conquests were preserved in historical chronicles and religious texts as examples of the catastrophes that could befall the Islamic world when it was divided and weak. Now, let me tell you about a crucial aspect of this history that often gets overlooked: the experiences of the Mongol women who witnessed and lived alongside these practices, because understanding their perspective is crucial to understanding how this system functioned. Mongol women held positions of significant authority within Mongol society. They could own property, make business decisions, and exercise political influence in ways that would have been unusual in the settled civilizations the Mongols conquered. Genghis Khan's wives and the wives of his sons held real power, managing vast territories during their husband's absence on campaigns, making political and military decisions that affected millions of people. These powerful Mongol women lived in households where captured enemy women served as slaves and concubines. They supervised these captured women, gave them orders, and benefited from their labor. Some Mongol women probably developed relationships with captured women, perhaps treating them with some kindness or at least pragmatic fairness. Others may have been cruel, taking out on captured women their own frustrations, or asserting their authority through harsh treatment. The presence of captured enemy women in Mongol households created complex dynamics. A Mongol noblewoman might have to share her husband with captured concubines from conquered peoples. Her children would grow up alongside half-siblings born to these captured women. The household would be multilingual and multicultural in ways that required management and negotiation. Some Mongol women embraced the system enthusiastically, seeing captured enemy women as trophies that demonstrated their husband's success and their own family's power. They might display captured noblewomen at feasts and celebrations, using them as visible symbols of Mongol superiority. They might boast to other Mongol women about the high status of the captured women serving in their households. "My husband captured a Chinese princess. We have the daughter of a Persian Shah working in our kitchens. Other Mongol women may have felt uncomfortable with the system but accepted it as normal. They had grown up in a culture where capturing enemy women was standard practice, where the humiliation of defeated enemies' wives was celebrated as right and proper, where treating conquered people as property was simply how things were done. They might not have questioned it any more than they questioned other aspects of Mongol life. A few Mongol women may have felt sympathy for captured women, recognizing in them a shared humanity, but they would have had limited ability or willingness to help. Going against the system would have meant challenging Mongol authority and custom, something that could be dangerous even for high-ranking Mongol noblewomen. The system was too powerful, too central to Mongol conquest strategy for individuals to oppose it. The complexity of these dynamics is important to understand because it shows how systems of systematic humiliation and enslavement are maintained not just by the men who implement them directly, but by entire societies that normalize, support them. Mongol women were not the primary decision-makers about how captured enemy wives were treated, but their participation in the system, supervising captured women, benefiting from their labor, accepting the presence of captured concubines in their households, was crucial to making the system work. This is a pattern seen throughout history in systems of slavery and systematic oppression. People who are not the primary architects of the system still participate in and benefit from it, and their participation helps maintain and legitimize it. Understanding this is crucial to understanding how such systems can persist across generations, and why they're so difficult to dismantle. Now, let me tell you about how this system eventually began to change, because it did not last forever. As the Mongol Empire fragmented, and as the successor Khanates became more integrated with the cultures they had conquered, some aspects of this system began to soften or transform. The Yuan dynasty in China, established by Kublai Khan, gradually adopted more Chinese cultural practices over its 97-year existence. Later, Yuan emperors married Chinese noblewomen in arrangements that looked more like traditional dynastic marriages than the forced captivities of the early conquest period. The presence of captured Chinese women in Mongol households became less about humiliation and more about integrating Chinese elite families into the Mongol Chinese governing structure. The Ilkhanate in Persia converted to Islam in the early 1300s, and Islamic law required different treatment of women than Mongol custom had practiced. While the Ilkhan still took multiple wives and concubines, the systematic humiliation of captured noblewomen became less central to their rule as they became more Persianized. The Golden Horde in Russia eventually fragmented into smaller khanates that became more integrated with local populations. The practice of capturing and enslaving Russian noblewomen continued, but became less systematic, less central to political strategy, more like the random violence of warfare than the calculated terror system that Genghis Khan had established. By the late 1400s, more than 2 centuries after Genghis Khan's death, most of the Mongol successor states had abandoned or significantly modified the practices he had established. The systematic targeting and humiliation of enemy wives as a central element of conquest strategy had largely ended, though many of its effects and memories persisted. The Mongol Empire had fragmented. The universal conquest that Genghis Khan had dreamed of had proven impossible to sustain. New kingdoms and empires rose that pushed back against Mongol authority or absorbed the remnants of Mongol power. The age of Mongol dominance ended, and with it the systematic implementation of the practices I've described. But the historical memory remained. The chronicles written by Persian, Chinese, Russian, and other historians recorded what had happened. The stories of captured queens and humiliated noblewomen were preserved in historical texts, in oral traditions, in the collective memory of the peoples who had been conquered. These stories became part of how people understood the Mongol conquests, part of the terrible legacy of Genghis Khan's empire building. They were told as warnings about the costs of conquest, as examples of the depths of human cruelty, as reminders of what could happen when systematic humiliation was wielded as a weapon of war. Now, coming to the end of this history, Let me tell you what we should take away from these stories, what understanding them teaches us about conquest, power, and the real costs of empire building. The story of what Genghis Khan did to the wives of his enemies is not just ancient history. It's a case study in how systematic humiliation can be weaponized, how women's bodies become battlefields in conflicts between men, how psychological warfare can be as effective as military force, how creating memorable examples of what happens to resistors can terrify entire populations into submission. These practices worked. They achieved their strategic objectives. The Mongol Empire was built partly on the foundation of this terror. Cities surrendered rather than fight because rulers knew what would happen to their families if they resisted. Regions submitted to Mongol authority because the alternative, resistance leading to the capture and enslavement of noble families, seemed worse than accepting Mongol rule. But the success of these practices does not make them less horrifying or less worthy of condemnation. Genghis Khan's genius at psychological warfare does not excuse what was done to Turkin Katun and thousands of other women like her. The strategic effectiveness of systematic humiliation does not justify the suffering of women who were captured, enslaved, forced into marriages with their captors, forced to watch their children raised as Mongols, forced to participate in the celebration of their own family's destruction. Understanding this history requires holding multiple truths in tension. We can acknowledge that Genghis Khan was a brilliant military strategist who built an unprecedented empire, while also acknowledging that his methods were built on systematic cruelty and humiliation. We can understand the strategic logic of his treatment of enemy wives, while also condemning the practice as deeply wrong. We can study how and why these practices were effective, while also honoring the memory of the women who suffered under them. The women whose stories I've told you, Turkin Katun, the Tangut princesses, the Song dynasty noblewomen, the countless others whose names were lost to history, were real people. They lived, they suffered, they died, often far from their homes, separated from their families, their identities erased, their legacies forgotten, except as footnotes to the story of Mongol conquest. They deserve to be remembered, not as collateral damage in great men's wars, but as victims of systematic policies designed to break them. They deserve to be acknowledged as people whose suffering was not incidental but intentional, not random but calculated, not unfortunate but central to the very strategy that built one of history's largest empires. And we, looking back across 8 centuries, need to understand that these practices did not happen in some distant past that has no relevance to our present. The logic that made these practices effective, that humiliating your enemies is more devastating than killing them, that targeting families breaks resistance more effectively than targeting armies, that creating memorable examples of what happens to resistors terrifies populations into submission, that logic did not die with the Mongol Empire. Systematic sexual violence and warfare continues to this day in various forms. Women continue to be targeted not just as incidental victims of violence, but as deliberate targets whose humiliation serves strategic purposes. The specific practices have changed, but the underlying logic persists in too many places. Understanding the history of what Genghis Khan did to the wives of his enemies, understanding it in all its calculated cruelty and strategic sophistication, helps us understand patterns that continue to this day. It helps us recognize that systematic targeting of women in warfare is not primitive or irrational, but often coldly calculated to achieve specific strategic objectives, and recognizing those patterns is the first step toward breaking them. What do you think about this history? How should we remember Genghis Khan, as a brilliant strategist or as the architect of systematic cruelty? Can both be true? How should we remember the women whose suffering built the foundation of his empire? Leave your comments below. If you believe this history needs to be told, that we need to understand how systematic humiliation and sexual violence have been used throughout history as weapons of warfare, then subscribe to this channel and share this video. Hit that subscribe button right now. We explore the darkest aspects of human history not to celebrate them but to understand them, so we can recognize similar patterns when they emerge in our own time. The ruins of Samarkand still stand, one of the most beautiful cities in Central Asia, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by tourists who marvel at its architecture. But in those palaces, Turkin Katun stood in chains serving wine to the men who destroyed her family. In those halls where tourists now take photographs, the wives of kings and shahs were paraded as trophies to demonstrate the completeness of Mongol victory. The stones remember even if the tour guides don't mention it. The historical chronicles preserve the names of some of these women and the details of what happened to them. Though most remain anonymous, their suffering recorded only as part of the larger story of Mongol conquest. Remember Turkin Katun, the most powerful queen in Central Asia who died as a slave in Mongolia. Remember the Tangut princesses whose names were erased along with their entire nation. Remember the Song dynasty noblewomen whose children grew up as Mongols with no knowledge of their maternal heritage. Remember all the women whose names we do not know, who were captured and enslaved and forced to participate in the destruction of their own legacies. They were people. They suffered. They existed. And they deserve to be remembered not as trophies in men's conquest, but as human beings whose lives were destroyed by a system that treated them as property and instruments of humiliation. See you in the next video.